Welcome to Godless and Grounded. The figure of Moses is one of the most central characters in the Bible. He is presented as the lawgiver, the prophet, the liberator who led the Israelites out of Egypt, and the one who supposedly spoke directly with God on Mount Sinai. Yet when we carefully examine history, archaeology, and logic, something very troubling appears. There is no evidence that Moses ever existed outside the pages of the Bible. He seems to be a literary creation, a mythical invention meant to give authority to religious laws and traditions. Today, let us walk through 10 major proofs that strongly suggest Moses was invented by the Bible and did not exist as a real person in history. The first proof is the complete absence of any historical record of Moses outside of the Bible. Moses is supposed to have lived in Egypt, challenged the Pharaoh, caused plagues that devastated the land, and led hundreds of thousands of slaves out of Egypt. Such massive events should have left behind some trace. Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They documented wars, famines, building projects, religious rituals, even day-to-day events. Yet in all of Egyptian history, there is not a single mention of Moses, the plagues, or a mass exodus of slaves. Egypt at that time was one of the most powerful civilizations in the world, with extensive writing carved on monuments, papyrus scrolls, and temple walls. If a man had brought their kingdom to its knees with miraculous disasters, surely someone would have recorded it. But what we find is complete silence. The Egyptians do record their losses and struggles. They wrote about invasions, rebellions, and natural disasters. But Moses, who supposedly destroyed their economy and army, is absent. This silence is not a small detail. It is a thunderous silence. The second proof is the unrealistic numbers in the Exodus story. The Bible claims that around 600,000 men left Egypt with Moses, not counting women and children. That would mean at least 2 million people. To put that into perspective, imagine 2 million people walking through the desert for 40 years. This is a population larger than many nations at the time. Feeding them, housing them, and providing water would have been impossible, especially in barren desert regions where resources are scarce. Archaeologists have combed through the Sinai Desert where the Israelites supposedly wandered for decades, and they found nothing. No campsites, no pottery, no tools, no graves. 2 million people wandering for 40 years would leave mountains of evidence, yet the desert is empty. It is as if the story was written without considering how unrealistic these numbers are. The third proof is the borrowing of Moses' story from older myths and legends. When we examine ancient cultures that existed before the Bible was written, we find striking similarities. For example, the story of baby Moses being placed in a basket on the river to escape death mirrors an older story about Sargon of Akkad, a Mesopotamian king who lived centuries earlier. In that legend, Sargon was also placed in a basket as a baby, floated down a river, and rescued. These parallels are too close to be coincidence. Ancient writers often borrowed and reshaped myths to serve new purposes. By reusing familiar stories, the Bible's authors could make Moses' story more believable and powerful. But this also shows us that the figure of Moses was not original. He was stitched together from earlier legends, a recycled hero to fit Israel's religious narrative. The fourth proof is the contradictory details within the Bible itself about Moses' life. For example, the way Moses communicates with God is inconsistent. In some parts of the Bible, God speaks to Moses face-to-face as one speaks to a friend. In other parts, it says that no one can see God's face and live, not even Moses. These contradictions show that different authors wrote different traditions about Moses, and later editors tried to merge them together. When a story is real, details tend to be consistent because they are grounded in actual memory. When a character is invented by multiple storytellers, inconsistencies naturally appear. Moses looks more like a patchwork character created from multiple sources than a real historical figure. The fifth proof is the complete lack of archaeological evidence for the Exodus and Moses' leadership. Archaeology is a powerful tool that has confirmed many aspects of ancient history. We have evidence of cities, battles, migrations, and even small communities. But when it comes to Moses and the Exodus, there is nothing. Archaeologists have excavated Egyptian sites, desert regions, and ancient Israel. They have uncovered vast amounts of pottery, inscriptions, and settlements. Yet no trace of a large group of people suddenly arriving from Egypt in the 13th or 15th century BCE. The Israelites' culture shows no sudden break from Canaanite traditions, but rather emerges gradually within Canaan itself. This means that the Israelites were not outsiders led by Moses from Egypt, but were originally Canaanites, who later created a story about being delivered from slavery. Moses becomes the central figure of this invented story, but archaeology shows us the people never actually left Egypt. The sixth proof is that the laws attributed to Moses were not unique. The Bible presents Moses as the lawgiver who brought God's commandments to the Israelites. Yet when we compare these laws to older legal codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi from Mesopotamia, we find that many laws were borrowed or influenced by earlier traditions. Hammurabi's code, written centuries before Moses was supposed to have lived, already had rules about theft, murder, adultery, and property. The similarities suggest that Israel's laws were not delivered supernaturally, but were adapted from existing legal systems. Moses, as the sole divine lawgiver, was likely invented to give these laws greater authority by claiming they came directly from God. Imagine a leader trying to enforce laws by saying, "These are just my ideas." It would not carry the same weight as saying, "These laws come directly from God through Moses." The invention of Moses gave divine legitimacy to human-made laws. The seventh proof is that Moses appears more as a symbolic figure than a historical person. His life is filled with symbolic numbers and events that mirror myth rather than history. He fasts for 40 days, leads people for 40 years, climbs a mountain to receive tablets of stone, and performs miracles by turning sticks into snakes and splitting seas. These are not the kinds of events historians use to confirm real figures. They are literary and theological devices meant to teach lessons. For instance, the number 40 is used repeatedly in the Bible to symbolize trial and testing, not to describe literal history. Moses' story is full of this kind of symbolism, which makes him look like a character created to represent ideals rather than someone who actually lived. The eighth proof is the absence of Moses in other nations' records that would have overlapped with his supposed time. If 2 million Israelites suddenly appeared in Canaan after fleeing Egypt, the surrounding nations would have noticed. Yet in the records of neighboring peoples like the Canaanites, the Moabites, and others, we find no mention of Moses or the Exodus. Such as the Merneptah stele from around 1200 BCE, describe them as a small group within Canaan, not as newcomers arriving from Egypt. This historical record does not align with the story of Moses leading a massive migration. Instead, it suggests that the Israelites invented a story of foreign slavery and deliverance to explain their identity, and Moses became the face of that invented origin story. The ninth proof is the theological purpose of Moses' story. When you read the Bible, you notice that Moses is not just a character, but a necessary tool for the religion itself. He gives divine authority to Israel's covenant with God. He delivers the 10 Commandments. He organizes the priesthood and the rituals. Without Moses, the religion of ancient Israel would lack a founder figure who directly connects the people to God. In the same way that Rome had Romulus as a mythical founder, Israel had Moses. This shows that Moses was created to serve a religious function, not remembered because he actually existed. Myths often need a strong leader to anchor them, and Moses fits that role perfectly. The 10th proof is the timeline problem. Scholars have tried to place Moses in different periods of Egyptian history, but nothing fits. Some suggest the 13th century BCE during the reign of Ramses II. Others suggest the 15th century BCE. But in both cases, there is no real evidence. Moses does not fit into any real timeline. He belongs to the world of literature and religion, not history. When we gather all of this together, the picture is undeniable. No evidence outside the Bible, unrealistic numbers, borrowed myths, contradictions, absence of archaeology, borrowed laws, symbolic storytelling, silence from other nations, theological necessity, and timeline problems all point to the same conclusion. Moses was not a real historical figure. He was a character invented by the authors of the Bible to give authority, identity, and unity to their people. This conclusion might feel shocking to those who grew up hearing the story of Moses as literal truth. But it is not unique. Many ancient cultures invented founding figures and mythic heroes to explain their origins and values. The Romans had Romulus, the Greeks had Homeric heroes, the Mesopotamians had Gilgamesh. It does not make their cultural achievements any less interesting, but it does mean we should recognize Moses as myth, not history. When people hear that Moses may never have existed, the immediate reaction is often disbelief. After all, his story is one of the most famous in human history. But popularity does not equal truth. The fame of a story does not prove its reality. Moses is a cultural icon, but icons are not necessarily historical figures. Think about how human societies create their identities. Nations love to root their beginnings in dramatic events and heroic figures. It gives people a sense of unity and pride. Israel needed a founding hero, someone who connected them directly to divine authority, someone who could be larger than life. Moses filled that role perfectly. Now, let's return to the problem of Egypt's silence on the Exodus. People sometimes argue that maybe Egypt covered up the embarrassment of being defeated by Hebrew slaves, but that explanation does not make sense. Egypt was not afraid of recording defeats. They left records of invasions where they lost battles. They recorded times of famine. They described disasters that hit them. If a man like Moses had challenged the Pharaoh and humiliated him with 10 supernatural plagues, it would have been impossible to erase. It would be like trying to erase World War II from history. Too many people lived through it, too many witnesses, too many scars on society. Yet in Egyptian history, nothing matches the biblical plagues. The Nile turning to blood, swarms of locusts, death of all firstborns. These are massive events. Farmers, priests, and soldiers would have written about them. But there is nothing. This silence is louder than words. It tells us the events never happened, and the man at the center, Moses, was never there. Archaeology also dismantles the story. They can find small groups of nomads who lived thousands of years ago. They can find broken pots, arrowheads, tools, even ancient seeds. But for Moses and his people, there is nothing. The desert has been searched repeatedly by archaeologists. No remains, no pottery, no altars, no mass graves. If Moses truly led millions through that land, the desert should be overflowing with evidence. Instead, it is empty. The emptiness is, the evidence. Consider the story of Moses as a baby floating in a basket. At first glance, it looks beautiful and unique, but when we realize the same story existed centuries earlier about Sargon of Akkad, we see it is recycled mythology. Ancient cultures loved stories of abandoned babies who later became great leaders. It gave a sense of destiny and divine protection. Even in later times, stories like this repeat. In Rome, a prophecy claimed Romulus and Remus were destined for greatness, so the king tried to kill them, but they survived. In Greek myth, Oedipus was left to die but was rescued and rose to power. These recurring baby legends are not history. Moses' basket story fits this myth-making tradition, showing once again that he was a character created from existing templates. Now let's talk about contradictions. If Moses was a real person, details about his life would have been more consistent. For example, the Bible sometimes says he could see God face to face. At other times it says no one, not even Moses, could look at God. Which is it? Both cannot be true. The Bible also gives different accounts of how long Moses lived, what happened during the plagues, and how the laws were received. This confusion makes sense if different groups of writers created Moses' story separately and later editors tried to blend them. It does not make sense if one man actually lived and people remembered him. Memory might distort small details, but it does not produce outright contradictions about core events. Another problem is the laws. The Ten Commandments and other biblical rules are presented as unique, given directly by God through Moses. But when we place them alongside Hammurabi's code, written centuries earlier, we see strong similarities. Laws about theft, murder, adultery, and property rights already existed. In fact, they were common in many cultures. This makes sense. Societies everywhere developed laws to survive. Claiming these ordinary rules came from God through Moses was a way to give them divine weight. Imagine if a leader today passed ordinary laws and said, "These are my ideas." People might argue, but if he said, "These laws were given by God to me," people would fear to question. That is why Moses was invented, to put divine authority behind human laws. Let us also think about numbers. The Bible says around 2 million Israelites left Egypt. That is larger than the population of Egypt itself at the time. How could slaves outnumber their masters? On top of that, imagine feeding 2 million people in the desert. Where did the food and water come from? The Bible says manna fell from heaven. But if we look at history, nothing like this ever happened. No other culture mentions it. Egyptians traded with neighbors, recorded weather, and studied astronomy. They wrote about eclipses and floods, but no one records a supernatural rain of food lasting 40 years. The sheer impossibility of feeding that many people exposes the story as fiction. Now, let's zoom in on the symbolism in Moses' story. He fasts for 40 days. He leads for 40 years. The number 40 appears over and over. In ancient writing, 40 is a symbol of testing or trial. It is not meant to be taken literally. Jesus also fasts for 40 days. The flood in Genesis lasts 40 days. These patterns are literary tools, not history. When we see Moses' life framed by symbolic numbers and miracles, it becomes obvious he is a figure of myth, not a real man. The absence of Moses in surrounding cultures also matters. If Israel entered Canaan as a massive group led by Moses, the neighbors would have noticed. There would be records of wars, migrations, cultural clashes. Instead, archaeology shows Israelites slowly emerged within Canaan, blending from local tribes. They were not outsiders from Egypt. This means the entire foundation of Moses leading them out of slavery is false. They were never slaves in Egypt. They were always in Canaan. The Exodus is a national myth created to give them a dramatic origin story. We also need to consider the timeline. Historians have tried placing Moses in the 15th century BCE, then in the 13th century under Pharaoh Ramses II. But nothing matches. There were no massive groups of Hebrew slaves. There were no plagues. There was no desert wandering. Scholars are left with contradictions. The reason is simple. The story was never meant to match history. It was written centuries later by priests and scribes trying to unify their people and give their religion authority. Moses was their invention. One of the strongest clues comes from the fact that Israelite religion did not suddenly appear fully formed with Moses. Instead, it evolved slowly from Canaanite religion. Archaeologists found inscriptions where early Israelites worshipped Yahweh alongside Asherah, a goddess. They had idols. They shared customs with neighbors. Only later did priests write stories about Moses to claim a pure, divine origin. This is exactly what myth-making looks like. People rewrite their past to make themselves look chosen and special. If Moses truly existed, we would expect him to appear in Egyptian records, in desert archaeology, in neighboring nations' histories. We would expect evidence of 2 million people moving across land. We would expect cultural shifts matching an exodus. But none of this exists. Instead, what we see is myth, symbolism, borrowing stories, contradictions, and theological motives. Everything points to invention. And this raises an important question. Why invent Moses? The answer is power. If laws are just human, people can argue and change them. But if laws come from God through Moses, people are forced to obey. Moses gives divine legitimacy to rituals, sacrifices, and authority of priests. Without him, the whole system weakens. That is why his story had to be created. He was the bridge between ordinary humans and divine law, a necessary fiction. Let's compare this to other myths. The Greeks invented Hercules, a half-god hero who performed impossible tasks. Did anyone believe literally that a man killed a nine-headed serpent? Perhaps some did, but historians know it is myth. The Norse invented Odin, who hung on a tree to gain wisdom. These stories gave people moral lessons and identity. Moses is the same, a myth to anchor a culture. The difference is that billions today still think he was real. What is fascinating is how modern scholars now admit Moses likely never existed. They call him a literary figure, a foundational myth, or a composite character. They know the evidence is missing, yet religion still teaches Moses as history. This shows how myths can survive even after they are exposed. They survive because they serve identity, tradition, and power. So when we step back, the conclusion is clear. Moses is not a man of history, but a man of myth, a character born from borrowed stories, theological needs, and national identity building. His miracles never happened. His laws were borrowed. His journey left no trace. His timeline does not fit. And his people were never slaves in Egypt. The Bible invented Moses, and billions still believe. But seeing through this myth is powerful. It teaches us how humans create stories to explain their origins, justify their laws, and unite their people. It shows us how myths can shape entire civilizations. And it frees us from taking ancient stories literally when the evidence shows otherwise. Moses is fascinating, not because he lived, but because he reveals how humans invent history to serve religion.